Good evening, comrades. Am I audible? Just want to check before we start.
Yes, you are. Good evening.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I hope I'm also visible. My camera should be on. Can you see me on your side, Caesar?
Yes, you are visible. You're looking good.
All right. Now, thank you very much. Good evening, and welcome, comrades. We'd like to welcome everyone. I'd like to begin by firstly saying good evening and welcome. A special welcome to our distinguished guests. Dr. Gigaba, I'm seeing you're in the meeting now, and Dr. Golding, the principal of the school, or Tambo School of Leadership, the COO, the board members, the NEC, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, comrades, you are all welcome. My name is Lerato Ndlovu, and I will be your host this evening. On behalf of the school, we would like to again extend a very warm welcome as part of our series. This is our Masterclass Economic Policy series. And for those who've been with us for the whole month, we've had different lectures, debates, and as part of OR Tambo month, we've had a sequence of these. We've had quite a few of these, which are available on our social media and YouTube. So if you did miss out on some of them, you can go back and watch them. And this is, like I've already said, our Masterclass Economic Policy series. And we would like to thank you for participating in the lectures that we've had so far, participating in a lot of these classes which we've had over the past couple of months, and your general engagement and participation throughout the whole month as we've been celebrating President OR Tambo this particular month. And a special welcome to everybody who has been helpful in this process. So we do have people who actually write in and give their written inputs and even bring about ideas and thoughts and ideas on where we could go, which areas that we would need to look at going forward. So we'd like to extend a very special thank you to everyone who's participating on that end. As I've already introduced, this is our Masterclass series, and this falls under our Economic Policy series. And the last Economic Policy Masterclass that we had, it was in July. We've had different themes over the past couple of months. The last one, which was on economic policy, was in July, where we had Minister Sihle Zigalala and Prof. Huang Yeping from Peking University in China. And the respondent on that particular day was Dr. Neva Makhetla. And they came and gave various presentations on industrial policy for inclusive growth in South Africa. And for those who are present in that particular masterclass, they will tell you it was rich in engagement. It was rich in thought, engagement, questions. There were very tough questions which we had to grapple with in that particular session. And the presenters came and they gave various presentations, and the crux of it all was the making a case for reindustrialization in South Africa. So positioning reindustrialization as a cornerstone of inclusive economic growth and social transformation. The minister Zigalala went on to explain the national industrial policy in the spirit of the Freedom Charter, and highlighted the urgent need to confront these structural economic crises such as deindustrialization, unemployment, and inequality. He mainly framed the tackling of these crises. He used the 3Ds, which is decarbonization, digitalization, and diversification, to tackle these particular economic crises. So those who were in the room, I know there were points of contention and a lot of debate. I think debate is the correct word around this. And from there, we moved on. And in the second session, the class went on to discuss manufacturing. We delved into manufacturing, and the professor from Peking University went on to explain how China was able to maximize manufacturing and industrialization to bring about economic growth and also tackling the issue of unemployment. So bringing about employment, increasing employment. And part of the session, as the session went on, we also looked at localization, beneficiation of critical minerals. We also looked at empowering of SMMEs for economic development. The professor then went on to highlight a few issues. And one of the matters which he really focused on and he reeled in on was the issue of institutional reform, ethical governance, and Pan-African economic integration to ensure that industrial policy becomes a transformative instrument of equity, productivity, sovereignty, and realizing the vision of the Freedom Charter in South Africa, having a South Africa which is what, united, democratic, and economically just. And the masterclass left us with a lot of ideas. And I'm referring back to it because I want to give us a background where we come from with these classes. I just want to give a background of where we come from, and that will make the discussion going forward more fruitful and it will give context. Who's unmuted, but there's a bit of feedback. Okay, yes, I think it's gone now. So the masterclass left us with a bag full of with ideas, questions, thoughts, and where to from now. And one of the critical points, or one of the main arguments which were made at the end of the debate, is that if we're going to speak about any level of economic development, transformation, we need to come back to the question of the state. So the state, at the end of our class, it was, what is the role of the state in driving economic development and in driving economic development, now speaking also to unemployment? What is the role of the state? And that is where we find ourselves today. So today, what we have on the table as we continue the series of discussions that we've had over the past couple of months is, what is the role of what is the role of the state in economic development? And particularly, what is the role of state-owned entities in driving economic development? To take us through this class today, we really dug deep into our what you call this, our wealth banks, our knowledge of wealth banks. We dug deep, and we are honored today to have now Dr. Malusi Gigaba as our presenter and Dr. Desmond Golding as our respondent for today. As we are all, we are very familiar with the names, and that's what's also exciting about today, is that we are familiar with the names, so we can even reference some of the work that these two leaders have actually put out in our discussions. We all know Dr. Gigaba, a leader, scholar, policy thinker, whose career has really been intertwined with South Africa's developmental state agenda. Comrade Gigaba brings to this particular discussion a wealth of experience in governance, economic transformation, and public enterprise transformation. As the former Minister of Finance, we all know he spearheaded the 13-point economic recovery plan and presented a budget which addressed debt and funded new policy initiatives, as we all know, the free higher education agenda. Then also, when he was also Minister of Public Enterprises, so he was also former Minister of Public Enterprises, he provided strategic leadership over major state-owned entities, which include Eskom, Transnet, South African Airways, and the list goes on, as we all know them. He was overseeing infrastructure expansion, governance stabilization, the rollout of the supply development strategies, designed to anchor industrialization and inclusive growth. So we are bringing this evening someone who can actually give and shed light on the role of state-owned entities in economic development in the country. And beyond his ministerial roles, Beyond his ministerial roles, as we all know, and congratulations again, Comrade President, on your PhD. He just attained his PhD in Management and Governance, where his research focused on the role of South Africa's state-owned enterprises in achieving commercial and developmental objectives. His academic background and also his practical insights, because he has actually worked practically in these SOEs, is able to guide our conversation tonight and really provoke thoughts and spark new ideas of how we can look at the role of state entities in economic development. We welcome you, Dr. Gigaba, and our respondent this evening, as I had already introduced him briefly, is Dr. Desmond Golding. There are a few of us who, as the school, we are familiar with Dr. Golding. He's an expert in governance and a professional, and his academic journey. So he's not just a professional, but he's also an academic, is also very important for our conversation tonight. He has over 20 years experience in the public and private sector, and he has held few critical leadership roles, including head of economic development in KZN, and he's also the economic advisor to the Minister of Public Works. His expertise on governance has not just been academic, but also practical, in a sense that he has chaired various state-owned entities. Specifically, he has been on the South African Civil Aviation Authorities Board, the SABC Audit and Risk Committee, Gautrain Management Agency, and currently he's serving as the chairperson of the National Housing Financing Corporation. Academically, he holds a PhD in corporate governance and public entities. So again, I would like to emphasize that we're very intentional this evening. We were very intentional this evening in who is selected for this particular discussion. As you have heard from both sides, we have a wealth of knowledge, and that means we will have a lot of note-taking this evening. And in our note-taking, we'll be able to, like in our last masterclass, path a way forward of where we would like to see ourselves as a school, how we are influencing particular policy, and also generally the driving discussion amongst citizens on what is to come when we're speaking now of economic development in the country. We would like to thank you again to the two, and we would like to welcome you this evening. As we are about to continue with our engagements and actually begin our class this evening, I would like to just lay a couple of ground rules so that we have a smooth evening. A few things to note is that, and I'm noticing already here on the screen, there are some devices which are written iPhone, or just symbols. If we could kindly rename our devices to your name and your surname, that will make it easier for identifying when it's time for inputs, questions, and answers. So if you could kindly rename your device, your name and your surname, so that you're easily identified. Then the second part is that when it comes to muting, at all times, may our mics be muted. The only time your mic should be unmuted is if you've been identified and given the platform to ask your question or to give your input. Then when it comes to the actual questions and giving of input, we would appreciate it if you just let the presenters present or give a response present. Then you are able to raise your hand and ask your question or give your input. So for those whose mics are not working or you're in a loud place, we also have the chat section where you can place your comment and your question, and we will be able to engage your comment and question from there. And this evening, I will be helped by Caesar, who will be the one in the comment section to just give us the different questions and inputs from there. And yes, I think that is all the rules from my side for this evening. And I would like to welcome you once again as we welcome, if we were in a room, I'd say let's give a round of applause as we welcome Comrade Gigaba to come and give us a presentation for this evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Oops. Thank you very much for this opportunity and for the extensive introduction. You know, I've known Comrade Desmond for a long time, over a long period. We served with him in the Youth League's National Youth Development Task Team back in the late 90s until the mid-2000s. I'm quite pleased to recognize him. I'm sure both of us and all of those who were in that NYTT didn't know that one day we would be doctors. And I wish to congratulate him on his massive milestone, which I believe is important for the country as a whole. Secondly, I've suggested, and I wish to reiterate this request that we have a podcast of the school which will interview comrades. There are many comrades who are graduating with PhDs, many who are less celebrated than some of us are. And I think it would be a great initiative for us to have a podcast where we interview them, we understand what were their research objectives, what really bothered them to study whatever they studied, be it in natural or social sciences or in any other field, and to understand their findings, their recommendations, and how they help the project of the National Democratic Revolution, the project of governance, and the fields in which they are involved. I think it would go a long way to encourage and motivate a lot of young people, a lot of comrades who are involved in this very grueling exercise, because make no mistake, a PhD journey is a very grueling exercise. It's solitary, it drains you, it tests everything that you have. And I hope that this suggestion will be accepted in good faith, and hopefully it will assist us to project the ANC as a learning organization, as an intellectual organization, and an organization which can attract the best in society, which is the repository of the best. Having made those remarks, I would want to start by what I'm going to do is to give a brief overview of SOEs, very, very brief. And I want to go to then talk about them as instruments of public policy. And then I will talk about SOEs in the context of the post-colonial sub-Saharan African context. And then I will talk about them in the context of South Africa. Then I will go to recommendations. In the context of South Africa, I will refer very briefly to Eskom and Transnet, which were my case studies, because these were the two cases that I was studying, and that drew my particular interest to this topic. SOEs are fundamental tools of government policy. They are created to undertake essential long-term projects in infrastructure and technology that the private sector avoids due to the high risk and low profitability. The private sector would prefer a short time lead when it comes to the return on investment, which means that creates a market failure, and the government has to step in to address those issues and ensure that there is requisite infrastructure, economic and social. But I'm going to focus on the economic infrastructure, even though I will also refer to their social benefits. So SOEs are major economic players globally. They are responsible for a significant share of investment, employment, and market capitalization. It's estimated that they account for over 20% of global investment. They dominate key infrastructure sectors and represent nearly 20% of market share of the world's top listed companies, the Fortune 500. Their contribution to GDP is substantial, especially in emerging economies like China and others, where they are a backbone of the industrial sector. But most of the SOEs that really have been studied are either Western SOEs within the OECD countries, but mostly it's the Chinese SOEs. There hasn't really been sufficient, yes, it has been there, but there hasn't been sufficiently extensive study of SOEs in Africa, particularly in the post-colonial environment. Now, SOEs face a dual mandate dilemma. Unlike private firms, which are focused solely on profits, they must deliver the bottom line to their shareholders and investors. SOEs must drive economic development through industrialization, infrastructure expansion, and they must achieve public service objectives, that is, social and strategic objectives, such as equitable access to services, job creation, national security, and expand services to underserved areas in the rural areas, in poor urban communities, and so on. This creates an inherent tension, as they must operate both as commercial entities, but on the other hand, as public policy entities. Their primary goal is fulfilling a public mission. It's not maximizing profit, which often means that the state forgoes financial returns for broader social benefit. South African SOEs, for example, were initially established as not-for-profit organizations. It was official state policy. They were not for profit. It's only in the late 80s that they were corporatized and commercialized and began now to have to become financially sustainable. But we will just talk a bit about that. Now, this multi-objective mandate can disadvantage them in competitive markets, especially when their public service obligations are not explicitly funded by the state, which leads to a financial strain. So to be financially sustainable while delivering on government's developmental objectives requires a correct balance between the government interest and, between the enterprise interest and the national interest. If an SOE is commercially unviable, if its balance sheet is weak and cannot fund capital expansion, it also cannot fund its developmental objectives. But on the other hand, if it does not focus on funding its developmental objectives, on executing developmental objectives, it nullifies the logic of it being a state-owned enterprise. It now becomes unwittingly or de facto a private enterprise. So because of that, among others, SOEs often face criticism for inefficiency due to several structural reasons. The first one is the principal agent problem. State-appointed managers may lack the incentive to maximize performance because of a number of reasons. Proximity to political leaders, because of that, the soft budget constraint, which is the expectation that government will bail an entity out regardless of the fact that it is sustainable, it is viable, it can run at a loss, but they know that government will bail them out. But the third reason is the free rider problem, which means that the public has little motivation to monitor management. The public tends to focus on government as the entity and may not know what is taking place within an entity, and because they don't vote for the management of these SOEs, they focus on government, which is the institution comprised of people for whom they vote. So all of these problems are critical in understanding SOEs, but are compounded by political influence, political interference, a lack of clear accountability, and the state's conflicting role as owner, regulator, and enforcer of the SOEs, which often undermines competitiveness. This is worsened when SOEs are evaluated solely on private sector financial performance, as I've indicated or alluded to earlier, which ignores their social and developmental goals, creating misalignment in terms of what they have to perform in relation to the dual mandates and how they are evaluated for performance. This misalignment, along with the financial burden of unfunded public mandates. Now, here I introduce another reality, that even though SOEs face these dual mandates, the public mandates are often unfunded. And every time you will have noticed when Eskom was implementing the National Electrification Program, that the question was, how are you going to fund this? Because the funding for that program couldn't come out of the balance sheet of Eskom. And if you were to ask Eskom to fund the electrification program, you therefore needed, as government subsequently did, to provide funding for this developmental mandate. This often leads to poor competitiveness and lack of sustainability. To succeed, SOEs need stronger governance and a clear framework for funding their non-commercial duties to better balance corporate and national interests, and to ensure that you change the performance matrix, the measurement matrix of the performance of SOEs. There is a comrade who has done that, who graduated recently at UNISA, who was looking specifically at what is the performance matrix that can be used to judge the performance of SOEs. And I think it would be a good thing to also at another stage bring him on as we interrogate this issue, because SOEs are critical are critical instruments of state capacity. Now, driven in the 1980s and 90s by neoliberal policies, many developing countries were coerced to privatize their SOEs and infrastructure, to introduce market discipline, improve efficiency, and reduce the state's financial burden. Oftentimes, when we talk about privatization, we focus only on the privatization of the entity, the SOE, and ignore the fact that it is often the SOEs and infrastructure capacity that can be privatized, and the two do not necessarily have the same level of impact, because you can privatize the firm, the company, but once you privatize infrastructure, you are now creating a whole set of new problems, such as access, universal provision, and cost of the service, and the fact that, as I will refer to later, this imposes a challenge on existing capital stock. So this often failed, this privatization, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, because it led to a decline in public investment and infrastructure quality. Public investment fell from a peak of 10% in the early 1990s to just over 5% in 2000 as a share of GDP, which left the capital stock severely weakened. The same applied in the South African context, where the investment ratio between the mid-70s, early 80s, and the 90s leading to now has been grossly misaligned. It fell from about, sometimes it's estimated at between 20 and even 50% of GDP to just less than 5% of GDP. And it only began picking up, especially after the 2010, during the preparations for the 2010 World Cup and in the period thereafter around 2012, when your Escoms, your Transnets expanded their capital expansion programs. Where privatization did happen, the private sector simply took over existing facilities without adding anything new to existing capacity. Now, here is a challenge. They simply took over existing facilities but did not add anything new to existing capacity. And they instead expected to be paid a premium in compensation for such investment. Evidence shows that privatization is not a guaranteed path to success, and that ownership is less critical than governance and competition. China's economic success compared to Russia's struggles demonstrates that fostering competition is more important for growth than wholesale privatization. This debate on privatization, which started now in the 80s and 90s, often got stuck between the pro-privatization and pro-state ownership views, which caused a policy paralysis that ignored a major international trend, which was the rise of a promising alternative, that of hybrid state-owned enterprises. Hybrid state-owned enterprises blend public purpose with private sector efficiency through mixed ownership, dual goals, and hybrid governance structures. They are characterized, so you could have a wholly state-owned enterprise, but it consists of hybrid characteristics, especially in terms of governance and so on. These hybrid SOEs are characterized by mixed ownership, where there is a combination of state and private shareholders, dual goals, pursuit of both commercial profitability and public policy objectives, competing logics, where you navigate conflicting demands from state and market shareholders, dual funding, where resources are sought from both market revenues and state subsidies, and hybrid governance, where in terms of which corporate structures are subject to both public accountability and private sector control. And that's why I'm saying, while all SOEs comprise of two or more of these characteristics, you could have a wholly state-owned enterprise that is hybrid in character and how it operates. In actual fact, literally all of them, except the non-commercial entities which rely solely on government subsidies and funding. But even then, in terms of their governance, they also consist of these characteristics. Telkom, in this regard, serves as a prime example of a clinical South African hybrid state-owned enterprise. While listed on the JSE, with significant private ownership, the South African government retains effective control through a direct stake and an additional stake by the state-owned PIC. There's a number of other entities in China which also are now composed in similar fashion, where the state has a minority shareholding, but it complements that through funding by state-owned banks and even by other SOEs, like in Huawei and other entities such as those. This structure forces Telkom to balance commercial objectives with national public policy goals, such as expanding broadband access under a hybrid governance model. Ultimately, the future of SOE reform lies in moving beyond the outdated binary and formally exploring a hybrid model. In this regard, the government must act as a professional rather than political shareholder. And for this model to succeed, key reforms are needed. One, you need to strengthen governance and board independence to buffer against political interference. Two, legislate clear mandates and separate commercial from public service activities. Three, ensure competitive neutrality with the private sector, which was the big concern with the formation of ISCO and the continued support of ISCO by government. The private sector was concerned about the erosion of competitive neutrality. Fourth, you must professionalize state ownership by centralizing it in an autonomous body. And fifth, you must enhance transparency and reporting. But I will come back to this when I conclude. Let me move on to SOEs in post-colonial sub-Saharan Africa. There is a significant gap in the literature concerning SOEs in post-colonial sub-Saharan Africa and their contribution to state capacity and sustainable development. There is, however, a debate, a progressive debate. Hamza Alavi, Professor Shivjin, Tanzania, John Salz, and many others who are engaged in this debate, Debray in Latin America, who are leading, I think, ideologues and theoreticians on the role of the state, of the post-colonial state, the challenges it faces. Professor Thandika Mkandawiri, Kohli, and others who are engaged in this. But all of those debates and many people who have, some people who have written on SOEs in post-colonial Africa have not really gone deep. And I think that for those on this platform who may want to pursue this going forward at doctoral level, this is a research gap. I think we need to do a significant in-depth research on the post-colonial state capacity, particularly on SOEs in post-colonial Africa. However, Africa's failure to achieve meaningful development after independence is widely blamed on neo-patrimonialism, on corruption and failure of governance, and failure of the post-colonial socio-economic and political systems. This has, however, ignored the devastating impact of neo-colonialism, of imperialism, globalization, which have sabotaged Africa's economic potential and led new states to preserve the previous colonial systems of power and administration. In post-colonial Africa, SOEs were established to drive development, redistribute income, and create jobs in the face of a weak private sector and underdeveloped markets. I think there is an interesting book by comrade, the late Ben Turok, though focusing on Zambia, but which talks about the dilemmas of the state in post-colonial Africa and the shift towards state capitalism and where it failed. They remain, SOEs, vital economic pillars in the post-colonial environment, accounting for a large share of public investment and formal employment. However, many are chronically loss-making and they create a fiscal drain. Following independence, many African governments established SOEs to redistribute wealth and spur economic development, as their private sectors were too weak to compete with foreign interests. These SOEs were used to create jobs and transfer assets to a new entrepreneurial class. However, they were subsequently blamed by World Bank, IMF, and other institutions for the region's economic woes, which led to the advocacy for privatization. Critics argue that this neoliberal stance was misguided, ignoring the real problems of underdeveloped markets, weak state capacity, and the complex social costs of privatization. And several scholars have argued that instead of wholesale privatization, the focus should be on reforming SOEs for efficiency and tailoring solutions to local institutional contexts. The region's economic struggles are not solely due to internal failures, but are a systematic outcome of structural challenges, colonial legacies, and external pressures. Therefore, a tailored approach to reform rather than rigid privatization is necessary. South Africa's SOEs have a complex history. Initially serving the apartheid state and being central to South Africa's socio-economic landscape. They were established to drive industrialization, serve the political goals of white minority rule, provide cheap infrastructure for the white population, all while being underpinned by the super exploitation of cheap black labor. Later in the 80s and even 70s, they began to be used to drum up huge debt in order to support the apartheid project. And at some point, SAA was used to illicitly transport weapons into South Africa. The apartheid state in the late 80s began to battle under international sanctions, global recession, and domestic unrest. It had run a huge and unsustainable public debt, driving the state and SOEs to the brink and struggling to fund its policies. And influenced by a global push for privatization, the government took initial steps to privatize, commercialize, and corporatize SOEs. South Africa's shift to democracy created a pivotal moment, forcing a clash between the old state-controlled model and new demands for a liberalized system. Privatization sought to boost efficiency and alleviate the public debt from the apartheid era. Commercialization aimed to eliminate public funding, forcing SOEs to operate for profit. And finally, corporatization transformed SOEs into self-sustaining entities governed by the same commercial laws as private companies, such as the Companies Act and the King Code. This involved removing state subsidies and privileges while granting SOE managers autonomy and incentives comparable to those of the private sector counterparts, all to foster greater competition and effectiveness. Although SOEs were functional under apartheid, they were heavily supported and their benefits were racially exclusive, disproportionately developing the white areas and, as stated above, based on class and racial super exploitation. To sustain apartheid, the government placed massive financial demands on SOEs, irresponsibly accumulating debt that crippled their financial health. This legacy included poor corporate governance, an ambiguous ownership structure, and a significant infrastructure deficit. Eskom, Transnet itself, SAA were all victims of this irresponsible governance oversight by the apartheid regime. Post-1994, these inherited weaknesses were worsened by factors like weak leadership, political interference, and systemic corruption. In addition, SOEs were expected to support Black economic empowerment and national development goals, such as the National Electrification Program, to which I've earlier alluded. However, they are now plagued by systemic problems identified in the Presidential Review Commission in 2012, including lack of a clear national policy framework for SOEs that explains how they fit into the national development strategy, whether, as it happened earlier, whether they were going to be privatized or not, which impacted on their appetite to invest in new capital expansion. They were affected by a convoluted and overbearing oversight, leading to accountability gaps, multiple competing and often unfunded mandates, poor financial management and inadequate capitalization, rampant corruption, and political interference. In addition, they suffer from inadequate capitalization, below cost pricing, impact of poor investment decisions of the past, and poor collection for services. This has resulted in mission confusion, operational dysfunction, and financial unsustainability. You could see that with Eskom, which was founded to power industrialization. It expanded massively, but then underinvested for a decade due to privatization uncertainty, but also due to the fact that the apartheid government overinvested in capital expansion but did not have a proper funding mechanism for it. By the mid-70s, Eskom was running over capacity and over investment. whilst it was serving only a minority of the population. This, combined with a flawed business model of financing large bills through debt, led to the current capacity crisis and load shedding. The unsustainable debt and operational inefficiencies have necessitated a fundamental restructuring. If you look at Transnet, its origins are tied to the mining sector. It was to provide routes from the pits to the ports for the export of primary commodities across rugged terrains. And it exists even to this day along those lines. It has long struggled with a dual mandate of commercial operation and providing cheap developmental transport. After periods of loss and restructuring, it launched a major investment strategy to shift from maintaining assets to enabling economic growth, though it still grapples with its complex developmental role. Having been successfully reformed, sustainably being run at a profit, and having a higher credit rating than the sovereign, it has recently hit a slump. Now, the above shows that SOEs have the potential to be powerful tools for sustainable development. But in South Africa, this is severely undermined by poor governance, corruption, political interference, a critical lack of policy clarity, and lack of funding for developmental objectives. The core issue is a policy vacuum that leaves SOEs without a clear purpose and forces them to fund public mandates from their own weak balance sheet. Key recommendations for reform include: 1, policy and legislative reforms. There is a need for a clear overarching policy and legislative framework that addresses ownership, regulation, and shareholder oversight, particularly for commercial enterprises. This should address all SOEs, regardless of the current shareholder oversight mechanisms. 2, governance reforms. We need to separate the government's role as owner from its role as manager to eliminate political interference. Now, this is not this clinical, it's not so clear-cut. And I think looking at the Chinese model of say, we need to establish a centralized autonomous body, to professionally oversee all major SOEs. We need to clarify funding. We need clarity on funding so that we have a transparent mechanism for the state to fund developmental objectives. Fourthly, we need to professionalize SOEs by adopting an efficient private sector-like practice and focus on long-term institutional capacity building. This is the same we're referring to when we're talking of hybrid SOEs. And fifth, we need to clarify accountability and transparency by ensuring that SOEs are held accountable through robust reporting and public participation, which takes into consideration their specific environment. Now, ultimately, SOE reform must not be ad hoc. That is in conclusion. SOE reform must not be ad hoc, knee-jerk, or ideologically driven. It must not be ad hoc, knee-jerk, or ideologically driven, but must be guided by the overarching goal of development and economic transformation, improving the well-being of all citizens, especially the poor and working class, and building a more equitable economy. For the ANC, this means that all SOE reforms must be an intentional program, driven through a comprehensive national conference resolution based on the economic transformation program of the NDR, linked with the broader macro reform of our economy, building state capacity for the improvement of overall well-being of the people, especially the rural poor and urban working class, and achieving total emancipation, that is, overhauling the social and economic relations of colonialism. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Doc, for that. That has been very helpful. Like I had already said in the beginning, ours tonight is to be taking a lot of notes, is to be taking a lot of notes. But before I open up for discussion and I also just throw in my 2 cents, I would like to give platform to Comrade Golding. Are you still in the? Yes, I'm seeing you. I'm seeing you. I'd like to give our respondent platform so that he gives his input. Then we will continue with our engagements. But thank you very much for that, Doc.
No, thank you very much, facilitator. My fraternal greetings to the principal of the schools, the participants that are in the platform, and also to the Dr. Gigaba, which we have known each other, as he indicated, for very many years as young youth league activists who were very idealistic in the late 1990s and the early 2000s. But what is very seminal about that particular kind of cohort of leadership is that we were not scared of pushing the boundaries and generating natural ideas. One among them, which still remains an obsession from my side, is the creation of a real, fully fledged state bank. And in my persecution, I may make references to that. So this is a kind of a deliberate and an intentional engagement that one has had throughout. And I should be able to indicate that facilitator and the participants that my research on state-owned companies was mainly on looking at the challenges that are faced by public entities in South Africa, particularly on issues of corporate governance. You will see that I will try to disaggregate and make sure that we work from proper definitions. Public entities is an all-encompassing concept, which includes state-owned companies, which mainly would be of commercial nature or commercial driven, state-owned entities, which are created in part for commercial purposes, sometimes for non-commercial purposes, or completely for non-commercial purposes. So you would find that in South Africa, when you say state-owned companies and public entities and state-owned companies as well, I may have missed that. It's always like an agglomeration of these concepts, but we need to be able to delineate them. Public entities are state-owned companies, state-owned enterprises, as well as other parastatals that may be there. And I may actually indicate, as I persuade my point, that in this country, we've got over 1,104 state-owned companies, which are concentrated in the national sphere, the provincial sphere, as well as in the local sphere. And all these balkanized definitions and character and form of institutions are all governed differently. And I'm going to be able to demonstrate and make a case in terms of my experience and what, in fact, my research has found. I know that Dr. Gigaba, in fact, has tried to deal with issues of the policy architecture and how the historical factors may have played a role. I will try to be deliberate in my engagement, to be more transactional, to be more practical on typical anecdotes that these particular entities are facing. And you will see that at the end, I will actually broadly present the model that I actually developed, which in fact at the university, it was highly commended because it is one unique model in a way that in many jurisdictions all over the world, you'd find that there isn't one that exists of this sort, let alone in South Africa. It is correct that these public entities play a critical role in terms of ensuring and fostering economic growth, industrial development, as well as social transformation. There is no doubt that their role will always be premised on the role of the state. As you would know, there are various philosophers and great thinkers like John Locke, who actually conceptualized the role of the state and the role of government, wherein he was very deliberate in a sense that he actually makes the point that the theory of divine right needs to be deconstructed and dismantled and replaced by a theory of a government that represents the aspirations of the people and their well-being. So you'd find that the role of government and the role of the state at place is that of ensuring the well-being of the people. If governments fail to look after the well-being of the people, you would actually experience what was experienced in many territories, but particularly in 1789 at the French Revolution, where the people were sick and tired of what the rulers of the time were doing, and dismantle, that rule, which in fact never represented their aspirations. I'm demonstrating this particular point, facilitator and the colleagues in the platform, to actually posit quite strongly that the role of the state-owned companies, state-owned entities, or broadly speaking, public entities, it's central to the government agenda. Like in South Africa, for an example, it has to be central in making sure that the role and the definition and the trajectory and the posture of the developmental state find its expression, find its application or delivery expression through these state-owned companies, because they play a critical role. We know that as South Africa, we're a country which actually is highly unequal, a country where you would find that lots of people would actually go home without any food in their stomach. About 58% of our people are hungry, exacerbated by the fact that, using the expanded definition, about 30% of our people are without employment. If you expand it more, you'd find that it is actually closer to the margin of 50. And the Gini coefficients also indicate that at 0.63%, we are a highly unequal society. So therefore, the role that the state must play is to make sure that it delivers to the well-being of these particular people. And at the center of that are these actually state-owned companies or public entities. In fact, there is a lot of write-up, globally, in terms of their contribution to a GDP. And I think my colleague, Dr. Gigaba, has given an indication in terms of what role do they play, in fact, in the economy. You'd find that globally, their average contribution to the economy is at about 20%. In the African continent, it's actually at about 15%, and in Asia, 8%, in Latin America, about 6%. In South Africa, it hovers around 5.8%, which actually is not much. And these are the observations that the World Bank has made, in a sense that there is a propagation, that these entities are very important in terms of driving economic development, driving inclusive growth, driving the integration of the marginal, from the grinds of the economy. There's various theories which I do not want, in fact, to propagate today around the role of state-owned companies. For an example, where you know that in their main, they may actually be centered around four theories. The agency theory, where they are an agent of government in terms of implementing certain imperatives that government may not actually be able to do. The other theories which actually these public entities find themselves is a shareholder theory, where it says that governments and these entities should make sure that in their policy proposition, as well as their application, they must make sure that stakeholders, which is the community, in fact, is taken on board, and many more other theories. So the key issue that, in fact, I want us to focus on tonight after that a broad introduction is as following. Why is it a problem that there is lack of good corporate governance in South Africa in terms of the public? Why is that a problem? Why is that despite legislative, what I would call infrastructure, whether you talk about the Constitution, Section 217, that talks about a prudential deployment of state resources, whether you talk about the Public Finance Management Act of 1999, that talks about the financial management, the treasury regulations, a King code on proper governance, and many other, the Companies Act, I may actually add into that, why you would find that these problems still persist. Why do you find that these governance challenges are actually tampered with through or by political interference? There's no accountability, there's no proper regulatory enforcement, and there's also a poor stakeholder engagement. The key issue that we need to ask ourselves is, in an event that these entities are poorly governed, and as the research would actually indicate, and as I will be able to propagate, what actually the research found, what actually are the solutions to this particular proposition. The key issue is, why is it a problem? It is a problem because if they are not properly and soundly governed, there will actually be a poor service delivery, and there will be a decline in the public trust by our people, by the populace. Hence, you would find that you have these unled revolutions that we have actually been able to experience all over the world, as well as even in Northern Africa, and also other people who may actually be military juntas taking advantage of the room that is being created by the lack of public trust. The second issue is, why is this a problem? It's because business community will lose confidence and start looking elsewhere to deploy their resources. As we know, in South Africa, we've got about 1.8 trillion that is investable but not invested, that sits with the commercial banks. So the key issue is, what is it that needs to be done to be able to unlock such valuable resources? The business community will always invest where there is business confidence. And therefore, it becomes important that these state-owned companies become reliable. They also play a partnership role with the private sector. But unless their balance sheets are healthy, unless there is less fruitless and wasteful expenditures, unless there's less unlawful and irregular expenditures, the private sector would not want to partner with state-owned companies. Hence, I'm underscoring the point of confidence that becomes important. The other aspect as well as to who gets affected by this particular problem is the very same government where its reputation is actually damaged. And if it is damaged, there's less investment appetite, and it puts then constraint into the fiscal muscle or ability of government to be able to resource capital and be able to perform other functions. And also, what becomes important is that in this particular analysis that, in fact, I said, I will actually be asking questions, is, should now these problems be not resolved, what happens? There will be persistent government failures that will lead to financial instability, that will lead to depressed economic growth, that will lead to continued and deepened corruption and inefficiencies in terms of service delivery. The public trust I've spoken about, the business community confidence I've spoken about, and also the other thing as well is that it will have a knock-on effect on the key goals that even our government as South Africa is trying to pursue, that of inclusive growth as well as job creation. We know the priorities of our government. One is to deal with issues of unemployment or creation of unemployment, but also to create price stability and deal with the cost of living, because in an economy that is not growing, in an economy that is dependent to the outside world, you would find that we by extension import inflation into our economy. Hence, we may talk up until the cows come home, unless we are able to make sure that we foster governance, there is confidence, there is inward investment, there is also a hardcore infrastructure investment, which is actually the fixed capital formation in this country. We will not be able to create jobs. We will not actually be able to, in fact, produce and export into the international market. And by so doing, will actually be a dependent economy that will keep on, in fact, importing inflation from outside with a knock-on effect, particularly of the poor that we are actually trying to protect. So facilitator and members of the session today, of course, there's a lot of research that actually has been done throughout the world around these public entities, but I can actually indicate that in South Africa, there is, in fact, close to non-existent of research on public entities, research on governance of public entities, research on proper governance of public entities and their optimal performance. So there is, in fact, next to nil research that, in fact, exists. Even, in fact, when one was going through literature, I had actually also to depend into international literature. It's also very thin, even internationally. The bulk of the write-up is actually on corporate governance in the private sector. So therefore, going forward and academically, it becomes important, therefore, that this is one area that, in fact, such particular engagement would lay a groundwork for more further studies in the area and make sure that it is deepened not only for South Africa, but also for our state to be able to be successful. And this particular literature contribution will actually be able to make sure that it also assists policymakers to make proper policy pronouncement. So, facilitator, as I actually deal with the last aspect of my persuasion, I just actually want to, in fact, because other issues my colleague Gigaba has actually been able to deal with, I just want to actually share, because there's been a lot of initiatives, as I indicated, around regulating these public entities. And the work that has been done in terms of regulating them, it has not actually been, in fact, successful. And I would actually want to present the findings of the study together with the proposition in terms of the model that I've actually spoken about. So there is about 7 areas of the research that actually was found. One is the issue of political interference in the leadership appointment and operations. So therefore, the study says that there is a lot of interference politically when leadership in these public state-owned companies are actually made, whether at the board as well as the senior executives. Therefore, to be able to deal with these malice, we need to be able to make sure that we limit political influence. We are not saying that the governing party or the governing coalition or the governing majority must not actually get involved in terms of the deployment of who goes to these entities because they play a critical role. But they must be allowed to be, in fact, autonomous. There is, in fact, a contradistinction between being autonomous and being independent. What we are propagating is being autonomous, allowing them to operate on day-to-day without interference. A case in point, which actually is, in fact, internationally acclaimed, is the South African Reserve Bank, which has got operational independence. Sorry, operational autonomy. It does not have independence because its policy is still influenced by government of the day. So the point we are making is that it's important, therefore, that we limit political interference in the leadership and the operations of this organization without discounting the fact, based even also on the agency theory, that they must actually be accountable and they must actually be autonomous and be able to be accountable both to government as well as oversight entities, which may be parliament. But we have seen also, of course, that there is lots of examples where there has been political interference and a decay in terms of those particular institutions, where there's been lots of corruption, where there's been looting, where there's been raping of resources of this particular entity. So there is a lot of anecdotal evidence, which if we are able to make sure that there is limited political interference, these entities are given operational autonomy, they will actually be able to function optimally. The other aspect, facilitator, that in fact would want to persuade, which actually is part of the finding, is this dual governance structure that in fact we have been able to find, which leads into fragmentation. Let me make an example. In terms of the governance of the public entities, they are governed by and large by Section 49, 50, and 51 of the Public Finance Management Act that talks to the elections of the board, their fiduciary duties, and how they should operate and manage their resources. On the other hand, you've got the Companies Act, where the state-owned companies as well as state-owned entities would actually be governed by the Companies Act. So therefore, what tends to happen is that in some of these state-owned companies, and to a greater extent, the state-owned enterprises which have adopted the Companies Act, you have a situation where the appointment of the chief executive officer becomes a key issue. Is it government of the day, which is the cabinet, that appoints the chief executive officer, which will in turn be able, where there's transgression, discipline, and fire the chief executive officer? Or it will actually be the board that is seized with those particular powers, because in terms of the Companies Act, it is the board that can hire and fire the chief executive officer. So these particular kinds of a fragmented legal architecture and confusion, it opens the room for exploitation. And therefore, even in the model, we do talk strongly that there need to be legal certainty. That's why we are proposing, and we'll talk about it speedily, of an overarching framework model that will actually be able to be an umbrella policy architecture for all these state-owned companies to be able to be governed in a similar way. There is an initiative of the national state-owned entities, but it only looks at those that are commercially inclined. So that will further result into more polarization and more fragmentation. And in economics, there is a term which is called regulatory arbitrage. Regulatory arbitrage means when there is uncertainty or confusion or conflict of laws, then others are able to exploit that particular gap. Hence, we'll actually be talking quite strongly about the uniform legislative framework that will govern all the 1,104 state-owned companies in wherever they are. Then you will have a disaggregated, governance mechanism, but at this stage, that does not exist. The other issue that, in fact, was a finding was that there's an unclear delineation of authority between the board, the CEO, as well as the shareholder. In this particular regard, the Public Finance Management Act says the chief executive officer is part of the accounting authority, which is the board, which for me is an anomaly. In the government department, the minister is an executive authority. The director general or the head of department is an accounting officer. In the state-owned companies or state-owned enterprises, that role is not clearly defined, because the CEO is actually clubbed together with the board as part of the accounting authority. So our view is that you need to be able to separate the CEO as well as the board, because currently the Public Finance Management Act does not actually deal with that. Hence, you would find that many chief executive officers find it easy to escape consequence management, wherein they would have breached the law or broken the law because they are part of the accounting authority. It even gets worse sometimes when the shareholder compact is also not very clear, because also the role of the shareholder, comes, into the fore. So these uncertainties must actually be ironed out, and the roles be clearly defined. There are weak governances as a fourth finding. Weak governances talk to the institutional governances that are there in the organization, whether it's for prudential financial management, whether it's for internal controls. You'd find that they are very weak. You'd find that in these institutions, there are no internal audits. The finding also find that in some of these institutions, there are weak internal audit capacities, or there are no audit committees, which plays a very and a key critical role in terms of oversight, but also accountability. So the weak governance mechanisms and the lack of internal controls has been actually isolated as one of the albatross around the performance of these entities. Then the next one is the issue of skills and capacity deficit, wherein the finding in this regard is that there is a lot of skills audit that has been done in many of the entities that actually have actually been studied, even from my own personal experience in some of the entities that have actually participated either as a board member or in fact as a board chair. When you do the skills audit, you find that the organization is not actually properly skilled. And therefore, in that particular regard, there is no doubt that in the lack of sufficient skilled people, productivity will actually suffer. That's why in some of the entities, you would find that an average performance of less than 50%, people do not see anything wrong. If you ask them, but this particular performance is way too dismal, they will indicate to you that, no, I think that's the best that we can do. But if you look at the skills audit, you'd find that there's a skills mismatch. So that is actually also one of the biggest findings that, in fact, the research has found. The other one is a poor stakeholder engagement and the trust deficit, which we actually spoke about. There's poor engagement with stakeholders. These entities are not responsive to the needs of the public. Most of the time, you'd find that they ignore even a shareholder, a directive or guidance. They actually would want to operate as autonomous. At the end of the day, in proper corporate governance of public entities, the shareholder plays a role as an overseer that provides policy, which actually therefore appoints the board. The board comes out with the strategy which needs to be implemented, and therefore management implement that particular strategy. So that a disaggregation of roles in proper corporate governance is there. But you would find that in the poor stakeholder management, within this value chain is bad. But in many cases, you would find that these particular entities would have bad relationships with either the shareholder or the board. And when they are being called upon to account, then they use their ability to have control to resources to start campaigning against the shareholder. In fact, the research came across quite a number of those entities where members of executives would actually disregard the shareholder or the board and use legacies to be actually able to, in fact, buy their flavors with other oversight entities or run, campaigns to discredit the board or the shareholder. And this is one aspect as well that needs to be strengthened with proper protocols. And lastly, Chair, before I talk to the model, is the issue of a negative culture, where in fact the findings were that there is in fact a culture of bullying, lack of accountability, a culture where it does not respect accountability as well as consequences management. So as I conclude, Chair, I thought that maybe I must actually share this very briefly with yourself, which is actually I don't know whether, Chair, you are able to see what I'm beaming.
Yes,
I'm hoping you're able.
yes, we can see it now.
Okay, all right, great. Which, in fact, this is the model that we proposed that must actually govern these particular entities, given the fact that there is regulatory uncertainty, there's regulatory confusion, there's lack of accountability, and lack of internal control. So it starts from the top right, Chair, which talks about the imperatives. That is, there is a need of a uniform umbrella architecture. This uniform umbrella architecture will have to be anchored within the government of the day. That is, whatever are the priorities of the government of the day, it must be able to be anchored around that. For an example, that South Africa is a developmental state. You've got high unemployment, high inequalities, also high poverty incident, how the government can, play a key and an athletic role in terms of growing the economy. So this particular policy architecture of government must then be the baseline within which everything falls under as an umbrella, which currently does not exist. Secondly, you need to have the constitutional imperatives where these particular policy architecture and the role and the mandate of these entities are anchored within the Constitution so that they are able to be responsive but also accountable. In other instances, you would find that the Constitution, Section 217, talks about competitive deployment of state resources. You would find that some state-owned companies do not have even proper, bid committees, or the CEO is actually the chair of one of the bid committees, which completely violates and contradicts the constitutional imperatives of competitiveness and actually making sure that those who make decisions do not participate. So it must actually hang on that. National priorities, we have spoken about the 3 national priorities of government. So this is also dynamic that the government of the day, these entities must actually mirror the priorities of the government of the day, because you can't have a situation where the government of the day has got priorities which are A, B, C, and D. The state-owned companies are pursuing their own agenda, which is contrary to the priorities. Then the next issue, Chair, that in fact we are persuading is the issue of streamlining the legal and regulatory ecosystem. I did indicate that the contradictions in the Public Finance Management Act, the Companies Act, into greater extent sometimes to the Treasury regulations, as well as King, needs a proper regulatory ecosystem of these particular entities, which will then provide certainty. The role of the law in any jurisdiction is to provide 3 things: certainty, accountability, and projectability. That is, you need to know what to do. Currently, there is a lot of laws that in fact are there that in their own create confusion, and they also result in what I term regulatory arbitrage and fosters lack of accountability and corruption, as well as lack of transparency. The issue of delineation of duties, I've spoken about it, that within the legal ecosystem, we need to be able to make sure that there is a clear delineation of what the shareholder is doing, which will inform the accounting authority through a shareholder compact. The accounting authority must know exactly what its role are, as well as management, particularly the chief executive officer. If it means the chief executive officer becomes accounting officers, so it be, but you need to be able to delineate and clarify those roles, because the lack of those roles through experience, it results in terms of lot of malfeasance and exploitation of the legal gaps. Speedily, Chair, the autonomy from political interference, I've persuaded that a lot when I was doing the findings. These particular entities, their biggest challenge, therefore, is they must be autonomous from political interference. That is the day-to-day, where politicians or political leadership give instructions to management on their day-to-day operations. I did indicate that they must be autonomous, not independent, because the distinction between the two is that independent means there is no relationship, you do what you like. But autonomy means you still have accountability and you take also policy direction from your political principle. Then the next issue is the issue of risk management, that these institutions must have what is called an enterprise-wide risk management policies, which will actually assist the entities in mapping out risk as well as mitigating those risks, as a baseline and as a common thematic ingrained in the entities. That all of them must have internal controls, that all of them prescribed must have internal audits which are in-house. I'm always loath to internal audit because they're open to exploitation. They must have functional audit committees. You must not have a situation where management are members of audit committees and vice versa, as experience showed. The other one, integrated reporting and monitoring and evaluation. One of the biggest problems that what we're able to identify that we are propagating must be corrected as part of the blended governance model is that there is poor planning. Poor planning results into poor execution of delivery. So there must actually be proper and seamless planning. And it must be planning and reporting, not what actually is called malicious planning. Malicious planning or malicious reporting, where you report for the sake of reporting. Your reporting must be outcome-based in a sense that you say, I did not do A and B. I did A and B, and this is the impact that is there. So that must actually be integrated as part and parcel of evaluating their impact in the economy. The other one is the culture that promotes ethical leadership, that promotes accountability, that promotes transparency. Consequence management is also one thing that we found in the study, and we are propagating quite strongly, that consequence management is very key because many of the state-owned companies, the deepening of malfeasance, the deepening of corrupt practices, the deepening of abuse of state resources is because there is no clear consequence management. So that must actually be the DNA of the organization, where people would know that when you do wrong, this is actually going to happen. Hence, in fact, the many write-up in this area of public entities only germinates when there is a case, and then people start writing about the breakdown of systems, lack of transparent accounting. So we are saying, in the DNA, consequences management might be there. Consequences management must not only focus on transgression. Consequences management must also focus on failure to meet the targets that has been set. There are annual performance plans. If management fails to meet the annual performance plan, there must be consequences management. In this particular juncture, or currently it doesn't happen. And second last year is the institutional stability, which we are propagating quite strongly, as a fundamental that these institutions must actually be financially viable. They need to be a strong balance sheet. They must actually also sweat their balance sheet, because you've got entities that are sitting with huge billions of rand that they are not deployed. In the state, in the DFIs, which are development finance entities, you've got the IDC, which is actually the biggest, followed by the DBSA and others. Some of them have got lazy balance sheet because they do not sweat their balance sheet, whereas the country is actually facing a lot of socio-economic challenges. So we are saying these entities must not be reckless, but they need to be able to sweat their balance sheet. We need to also to be able to integrate in their planning partnership with the private sector so that they can be leveraged on their balance sheet and their limited resources. I think gone is the past where government and the private sector sees each other, in fact, as enemies. The two must work together to pursue socio-economic goals. In many jurisdictions and countries where the private sector works strongly with government, you'd find that there is lots and lots, in fact, of development that germinates from there. So the issue of prudential financial management, systems of financial management, healthy balance sheet, leveraging and sweating the assets, and having a project-based partnership with the private sector will assist these entities to expand their fiscal or their envelope and be able to meet many fundamental changes. And technology, we cannot underscore. We live in a knowledge economy that becomes important. And lastly, Chair, is the issue of stakeholder management that I did indicate that becomes important. Accountability. So, Chair, thank you very much for actually allowing us to present our research in terms of the challenges that are faced by state-owned companies, and also be more practical on the transactional or leadership side, as opposed to broader policy or macro strategic things, where we were looking at the micro behavior of these particular state-owned companies and what do we need to do fundamentally to change them, both from behavior as well as their governance. And this particular blended model framework, we think as a country we can adopt it, and it becomes a DNA of managing and monitoring these entities, and therefore their relationship with the government priorities and their optimal performance, we think, Chair, could actually be achieved. Chair, as I conclude as well, is that the DFIs, we also find, before I miss the point, that as much as they are also state-owned companies, and my colleague Gigaba made this point, and I thought, let me just persuade it as I conclude, is that our DFIs, as much as they are state-owned companies, they've got a developmental mandate. We had found that they do not operate to any different to commercial banks. In fact, they operate against the fundamentals of what the state is trying to achieve, because their pricing of debt is even higher than the commercial banks. And therefore, that is not justifiable. It's one of the things that we found, and we want to sponsor it around issues of financial viability, that in fact, if you want to calculate the value of money, you calculate it by money supply, M1 to M2, M3. M1 is when the Reserve Bank generates the money and print it, and it value chain, and M3, it's when the commercial banks are able then to borrow from the central bank and borrow it out. The cost of funds that the DFIs are receiving, they should not, at any given point, Chair, be based on a prime rate, because prime supposes that the bank has borrowed money at a repo rate plus 3.5%, then there's prime. The DFIs do not have that particular kind of borrowing from the central bank. So they need to be able to price very competitive to be able to allow government to have, in fact, more impact. And also the role that they play together with the state, creating a state bank, which is actually fully functional, is also some of the things that we think these are some of the DFIs that have a financial muscle that will actually be able to assist government in terms of meeting its priorities as well as its persecution. Thank you very much, Chair, and I hope I didn't take much time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doc. That was very, very, very informative. Let me just remove this here. Okay. Thank you very much for that. And I think my excitement, sorry about that. I think my excitement is also echoed in the comment section. I'm seeing there are a lot of input in the comment section. So thank you very much for that, Doc. And that is the beauty of these sessions which we have, is that we started off with the idea of how state-owned entities, their role in economic development. And now we have ended with the reality that we cannot speak of the role of SOEs in economic development, but the SOEs in themselves are not functioning. They're not functioning. They're not effective as an entity. So before we even get to the question of the role, we need to deal with these governance issues, which you have so clearly expanded on. And it reminds me of, when was it, 3 weeks ago, at the Kgalema Motlanthe Foundation, their annual their annual Inclusive Growth Forum. Our principal, Comrade David Makura, I'm not sure if he's in this meeting, actually delivered a paper where he was arguing for the desperate and the urgent need to move away from leadership. When we speak of the leadership question, moving focus from a leader to moving our focus now to strong governance structures. So I think what you have presented and the model which you have presented actually echoes so well what we have been talking about internally in the school, that we need to move away from leader-focused leadership, but we need to address this, which is our corporate governance as a whole, not leaders, but the structure as a whole. So thank you very much for that, Doc. And I had a couple other things where I wanted to give my input. However, I am seeing that we do have a lot of questions in the chat box and also a lot of hands which are raised, and we don't have enough time. We're supposed to end our session at around 8. So what I will do is that I'm going to open up the floor for those who have written in the comment section, but it was, sorry, I don't know. Yeah, for those who wrote in the comment section, but you would like to expand on the point which you made, maybe you were just taking notes, I will also give you an opportunity. So if you could just raise our hands, then I will note the hands which are up. So those who wrote in the comment section, you'd like to expand on your point, you can also raise your hand now so that you may be noted. I'm only seeing 5 hands. I'm only seeing 5 hands. So we will take the first round, then we will come to the second round. And because we don't have time, I will please plead, may we keep it to 2 minutes, no longer than 2 minutes. If you do go over the 2 minutes, I will indicate that you are over your 2 minutes. May you please wrap it up. Then if you're still taking long, please allow us to suppress you just because of time. So I will note hands. The first hand which I'm seeing here, okay. Penny, Comrade Penny, I'm seeing your number 1. Then number 2, it is Comrade Andile. Then we have Comrade Eric. Then we will go to, that was number what? That was number 3. We will go to Comrade Mutseki. Then we will go to Cindy. Then we will go to Comrade Songezo. Then we will go to Dr. Omano. Then we will, okay, yes. So that will be in that order. In that order, please. That will be our first round. Then we will do the second round. 2 minutes. The floor is yours.
Greetings, comrade, greetings. My 120 seconds starts now. Ngiyabonga ama-leadership. Ngifuna ukuthi ngithi nje kulo 120 seconds. Angicabanga ukuthi partially privatization of state-owned enterprises, it was the only solution that the governing party yayingakhona ukuthi ithathe. Ngicabanga mina ukuthi mhlambe zazikhona ezinye izinto ababengagcina bevumelene ngazo, hayi lena yoku-privatizer, they call it partially, to allow the private sector to come in and have a stake kuma-state owned, ngoba izathu mhlambe se-governing party ngaleso sikhathi leso kwawukuthi mhlambe inject some cash kuma-state owned ukuze ama-state owned enze profits, bakwazi futhi nokuthi arane efficiently. Lokho okungenza kube nombuzo comrade ukuthi kanti ama-state owned ama-SOEs yini kahle kahle umsebenzi wawo e-South Africa? Asingabuki amanye amazwe, asibuke lawa ethu South Africa. Kanti yini kakhulu imandate yawo ukuthi enze profit or enze just enough profit to sustain themselves? Yini esiyiphusha kakhulu ukuze ukuthi na a-compete profit wise private sector or bona, they must make enough just to sustain themselves. If they sustain themselves, any SOEs South Africa erana kahle ingakhona ukuthi i-economy development iflowe kamnandi eSouth Africa ngoba we've got a very important SOEs in South Africa amangasarane kahle arane kamnandi ngisho even abatshali bemali abafuna ukutshala imali South Africa, they can trust the country in nama SOEs arana kahle. Ipoint yami ithi I don't think ukuthi kwakumqondo ophelele nowanele ukuthi kuvunyelwe ukuthi ku-privatize some stake, partially privatization of the SOEs just because sifuna ukuthi enze profit bese akwazi ukuthi azilane kahle. Ucomrade ukwakhuluma wathi enye yezinto mhlawumbe yenza ukuthi ama-state owned ngathi mhlawumbe ayafeyila i-interference yama-politicians.
Comrade, the 2 minutes has lapsed, ne? The 2 minutes has lapsed.
Yama-politicians, it's like
Okay. All right. No, thank you. Then may we please go to the second hand?
Thank you very much, Comrade Chair. Dr. Gigaba and Comrade Golding, my question is with regards to the role of SOEs in creating employment, particularly focusing on Transnet, Eskom, Sanral, Denel, and Prasa to a certain extent. The reason why I focus on these SOEs is because they are in heavy industries. As people who've done research on this topic, are you satisfied with the jobs that have been created, particularly by these SOEs, in comparison with the role that they played in pre-1994? Thank you very much, comrades.
Thank you. Let's keep it in that fashion. Thank you for keeping within the time. Next speaker, please.
Chair, is that me?
Yes, that is you.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair. Chair, I would like to comment on SOEs that I see that the SOEs need definitely to stay as a state-owned enterprise or state-owned company, and then making sure that if they're working hand in hand with the private enterprises, every company needs to take responsibility. Then I don't see any problem of that. South Africa, we have got a problem where we have got a problem with the job creation. There's too much job in South Africa. The thing that is needed to be done is for us not to be lazy to think, and then how to create, to be creative, or to find leaders who are creative. So I would like definitely our leaders to think about that we can do better, working hand in hand with the state enterprise, working hand in hand with the private enterprises. And another thing is that the government must not be afraid of testing the new ideas and then stick on their own ideas only. They must also test the ideas that are coming with the new incoming young ones. They mustn't be afraid or get threatened by young ones. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much for that input. Then we will go to the next speaker. That's Comrade Mutseki.
No, thank you, Chair. I would like to start with an input, then I will follow with a question. The input is based on the notion that the SOEs are mimicking what national departments and national provincial governments are doing. That is why you will see that they do not play part in enforcing their mandates. So, comrades, categorically, clearly, I would like to say there is no way we can say the ANC should be away from government. And again, government should be away from SOEs. It is like saying you send a kid to school, but you do not assess them as a parent. It is not good, comrades. All SOEs were developed post-apartheid. They have the mandate that comes from the reforms of the ANC in government. The policies being implemented that they should implement come and are being derived from the National Democratic Revolution documents and policies. So, first, clearly, comrades, what SOEs are doing now is that they take funds from the government and now their capital expenditures are tendering, but they do not focus on the mandates. Their mandate particularly was not to create jobs. Their mandate is to issue out government permits so that people can take the permits, open up businesses, become self-employed, and now create jobs. So we are having this thing or this notion that economic development, comrades, but then we say unemployment. For every foreigner that is there in South Africa, we can equally say they are living a life of a South African. The only problem is that when they go and approach these SOEs or government departments for government permits, they get to be issued. But for Black South African, especially those who have even went through their further education training, who understands maybe how to run a business or how can one develop themselves out of government as a self-preservation, they cannot, comrades. I see one person argued about taxi. Taxi industry will forever be the same because we understood there's a big economy, but we do not translate to say how do others come through. That's why we have pirates. And secondly, comrades, I would like to
2
put
minutes is
on this.
running out, ne?
Yes, the last one is this: NSFAS, as a new established SOE that enforces on fee-free education, because at first it was not in that notion. If NSFAS takes 100 students to school, now I'm posing a question, to school this year, and they are able to can fund 3,000, actually a minimum of 30,000 for just 9 square meters, comrades. 30,000 just for 9 square meters on rental. It means our SOEs continuously preserve capitalism over what we can call a socialist working class system. That is why we have high unemployment. Every government coffers, they go into these industries, no matter NSFAS, no matter health, no matter what. But when they get there, someone at the end says, I need to benefit as a capitalist. So how will this money be disbursed? For underprivileged people, they do not want to rent or the government to rent on their behalf. What the students are seeking for is just accommodation. Just accommodation. So the government, for them to produce accommodation, is to make sure that, okay, for the 100 issued this annually, for next year, we must make
Comrade, your 2 minutes have
100
left,
bed
ne?
accommodations so that we do successful for the next 5 years. Yes, comrades, we need to be categorically clear. So the last one that I would like to post in 10 seconds, just in 10 seconds. Cadre deployment, comrades, is everywhere. And now even in SOEs is cadre for it is our own comrades that we do not assess them in terms of KPI. We should not shy away from that, comrades, because for executive authority in SOEs or government departments, specifically in administration, we expect that those that are deployed,
Okay,
they
your
understand
time
the
is up.
mandate of the aforesaid department and selfless.
Hello? Okay, I hope I'm still audible. Caesar, am I audible? I think I've lost connection now.
Yes, you're still audible.
Oh, yes, thank you. So we'll go to our next speaker.
Oh, okay. Oh, you cut me off, my leader. Okay, sorry. Is the person still available, or I can take their platform? Chair.
The person is still available and your time has lapsed. Thank you. Cindy, I think you are next in line.
Thank you, Lerato, and all protocol observed. So for me, it's more of a comment, but also a question. So I'll focus mostly on the parastatal institution, as mentioned by the previous colleague. So we've seen poor infrastructure, governance weaknesses, and the absence of a coordinated combined assurance, which was well articulated by the second presenter. So these weaknesses don't only slow service delivery, but they also erode investor confidence as investors are drawn to an environment that offer predictability, efficient execution, and credible governance. For example, last week I was attending an investor meeting with some Chinese, right? So we were discussing a project. We had done an estimation of 2 years. On their end, they said we can be able to execute this thing, in 8 months. So this gap highlights capacity constraints and inefficiencies on our side in delivering projects as the country, which discourage investment. In certain scale, investment, we may indeed need to partner with foreign investors or service providers due to local capacity limitation, but such partnerships should always ensure that there's always a transfer of skill. And obviously this becomes very important because sometimes when you are executing a project or you are bringing in foreign investors, there's always an issue of employment, within SA, but some projects, they require execution of certain scarce skills that we don't necessarily have, in our country as yet. So my question is, how can we practically reposition our SOEs to become credible, agile, and investment-ready institutions so that they not only attract capital, but also deliver on time and within accountability, while ensuring goal alignment across national, provincial, and municipal spheres so that our economic development agenda moves as one unified system rather than in silos. And I've seen this because I'm coming from private sector and I've joined government, and there's always that working in silos mentality between national, provincial, and your local government, which is your implementers at the end of the day. So how do we ensure, the coordinated ecosystem from all spheres of governance that enables the environment to drive for the investors? I don't know if that makes sense. I would like the speakers perhaps just to give some practical guidance on that, because these are the things that I might like to take back to the investment committee that I sit in so that we can practicalize them. Thank you.
Thank you. Comrade Zangezo, you're next.
Yes, asibonge sihlalo. Sibonge ithuba. Ngibingelele igama uSongezo from Ematatiele. Mina my concern is that the issue of the unaccountability of the consequences within the deployed or the people who are given tasks to run some of these state-owned companies would remain a factor or an issue. And number two, Chairman, so long as our state-owned companies are dysfunctional, it favors the private sector, because the dysfunctionality of the public sector gives more credit to the private sector. For an example, uma isibhedlela singenzi kahle, noma ngisho nje njalo, in terms of services, you would expect each and everyone to run to the private sector, to the privatized hospitals and other things. So nginentetho wena Sihlalo, one, if we want to address the issue of unemployment, we need to make our SOEs and all these governmental institutions functional, so that it comes with a point of addressing the matter of service delivery versus the human capital that is required, because the more the need, the more there would be the need of the people who render the services. But as long as we are having limited skills on that side and also transparency and issue accountability. That is why you will see most of the things flooding to the private sector. And we should remember that even if we try to partner with, we do this public-private partnership, but the interest of the private will never change. Private is always profit driven. Therefore, it minimizes the cost and maximizes the profit, of which one for government is to maximize at least it's to cap the issue of unemployment and also stabilize the services. So my point here is that to Dr. Gigaba and the fellow doctor, essentially, do we see as a private partnership as a progressive thing in terms of addressing the issue that is at hand as we speak, the unemployment issue, or else it would further give us the issue of having more young people and scores of Black Africans in particular being languishing in poverty and not working? Or else does it say we need to review this thing of saying the only thing that makes us not to be functional in terms of the state-owned entities is the issue of the interferences it was mentioned, because
Your
the
2
issue that
minutes
we have
is
is that
up.
we put people to these offices instead of driving the interest of the people. They intend to drive their own interest, or else they try to create a better class out of the class that we found within the society. Angibonge sir.
Thank you. And next speaker, Dr. Omano.
Thank you, Chairperson, and thank you to Dr. Gigaba and Dr. Golding. You have given us a lot to reflect on. So let me just make just a couple of comments. The first is that development by its nature is not a technical exercise, is a political project. And if you come from that premise, the role that SOE plays in any country is part of a developmentalist, or is part of a political project in every country. So I listened to the input by the two doctors, and I want to argue that most of the reasons they provided for why SOEs in South Africa and on the continent are where they are, I want to argue that most of those are actually outcome variables, not the explanatory variables. And I want to premise my position on the question of developmental state, because Dr. Golding threw that out, that South Africa is a developmental state. First, I will argue that South Africa is not in any way close to being a developmental state. In thinking of a developmental state, the first thing that you do is to look at the ideological orientation of the political elite and how that elite then be able to establish the institutional arrangement to be able to achieve its developmental objectives.
Doc, your time is running out.
Okay, my time. So the point that I want to make, that the crisis that we have in the SOE in the country is precisely because of the absence of a developmental elite, an elite that is committed to enhancing the productive resources of the country, including its human capital and every other resources that will make the country to be developed. As a consequence, I want to argue that what South Africa requires to be able to position the SOEs is to have a developmentalist elite that is driven by ideology of development nationalism. That once we do that, all the outcome variables that have been mentioned will be addressed. We need a developmentalist elite.
Thank you,
Thank
Doc.
you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for those inputs and those questions. I would like now to give platform to Dr. Gigaba. Then we'll come to you, Dr. Golding. Then from there, we will wrap it up from there. The platform is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to our facilitator and to all the comrades who asked questions. It does seem like a lot of issues which have been raised, but let me try and deal with a few and leave others for Comrade Dr. Golding to also deal with. I think Comrade Mhlonipheni, I did make the point strongly that the proffered solution of privatization, either of SOEs or the infrastructure itself, was inadequate. And anywhere on the African continent, it doesn't have any examples of outright success. What is important, I even made reference to the Chinese experience to say that compared to Russia, China focused on improving the competitiveness and efficiency of their SOEs. And on top of that, then carefully looked at which SOEs need to be privatized. So the reform program in China, which is what I was suggesting in the very last part of my presentation when I argued that the SOE reform program must be intentional and driven by the ANC through conference resolutions and extensive debate and by the NEC, is to say that the reform of SOEs, whether you privatize some or not, and which ones to privatize, which ones not to, where you bring in the private sector in the form of triple Ps or as minority or majority partners. That must be an intentional and deliberate program depending on what you want to achieve. Now, this takes me to the issue that Comrade Dr. Omano raises, because it's fundamental. The explanatory variable that for development to happen, one, development is political. I agree fully with that. Secondly, that for development to happen, we need a leadership with a developmentalist ideology, so that it takes into consideration not just development in its general frame, but in the context of a post-colonial environment. What capacity you want to develop for the state, how you want to develop your society, and therefore what type of state you want to have that's going to achieve that. So I want to agree with that and say that in how you reform your SOEs, therefore, and that's why I say it must be based on the program of the National Democratic Revolution. We must not be knee-jerk, we must not be ad hoc, we must not be tentative. We need to be very intentional. The next point, probably my last point, other issues, I'm sure, comrades, I don't know how we can find a way to resolve them. I don't know how much time I have, Comrade Lerato, to deal with some of the issues, but the SOEs have played a crucial role in creating employment. Eskom, Transnet are the leading SOEs in the country. The collapse of Denel has been unfortunate because the arms industry plays a crucial role in the development of your heavy industries. defense equipment actually plays that role, and Denel is crucial in that effort. I think we need to focus very strenuously at reforming our SOEs and placing them at a position where they are able to help us achieve our developmental goals. But for that to happen, we must address what is the macro policy of the state, how do SOEs fit into that, and any reform of SOEs must be with the intention to develop the South African economy in a particular direction. So long as we are tentative, today we have SOEs, tomorrow we're privatizing them, then we don't know whether we're privatizing them or not. So long as we will continue to have the challenges that we are facing. And perhaps finally, let me say, comrades, the SOEs have a crucial role to play in driving investment through their capital expenditure and even their operational expenditure. So what we need to do is to improve their governance to such an extent that we are able to drive both commercial interest as well as their developmental national interests. We need to ensure that we are able to balance the two. And I think that it is possible for us to achieve that. I think we need to learn a lot from what other countries are doing, and comrade like Omano would also assist a great deal in beefing up our understanding of the state in Africa and what we need to do in order. I'm a great follower of his writings and what the state ought to do in order to play a developmental role and forge a developmentalist elite on the African continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Golding, I think you can go up next.
Yeah, no, thanks very much, Chair. I think the input and the suggestions that actually have been put across, they are quite helpful. I think it will actually be near impossible or a disservice that one could deal with all the issues, whether they are questions or comments, but one will pick up issues that are quite critical, that are a building block to what we are talking about. Probably going forward, the school could be able to pick up in some of these incidental issues that are being raised and build, the profile of topics for the future, so that at least whatever that has been discussed today, at least there are continuous spin-off and focus on those micro issues that in fact are coming out of this. Because I think at the end of the day, the aim is to enrich the capacity of our leadership as a country to be able to analyze, think critically on issues, but also able to be bold in dealing with the issues. I'll pick up a few issues, facilitate. I'm not going to deal with them. First, I think it's important that we understand that the confusion that we find in the SOEs and their functionality and the expected role that they should be playing in the economy and in the society finds its expression in the disarticulation of the macroeconomic outlook or policy of this particular country. Give a quick example. If as a government, we would actually be keenly interested in protecting the purchasing power of the poor. Hence, you would find that we've got a central bank that its mandate goes to that particular extent. Why would you actually also equally have an industrial policy or an industrial outlook that seeks to export and be heavily prone to export. And we know that to be competitive in the market, your pricing or your currency must be competitive. So this disarticulation, Chair, is that they find their expression in the macroeconomic outlook. So our first point of departure will be to have a seamless articulation of the macroeconomic outlook, which therefore these entities can be able to find expression and play a role. Either they find themselves in the labor market, in the industrial sector, in the the fiscal sector, and so on. Then they're able to play a role and coordinate. One of the colleagues spoke about a silo functionality in government. It is also true because you find that at a macro strategic level, there isn't any proper coordination, and that expression you see it with the entities. So therefore, and I disagree with a colleague that says that South Africa is not a developmental state. In fact, South Africa is gradually moving from being a developmental state, which is defined, by the way, developmental state, as a state that has got a preoccupation, both in terms of policy pronouncement, a policy articulation on growing the economy, but also meeting the social imperative. That is how you would define a developmental state. And your Asian tigers have shown us that. And I mean, to a greater extent, China is a socialist, capitalist state, but without conflating the issues. That's what a developmental state is. That the policies of the ANC are quite clear in terms of who are the beneficiaries. The ANC calls them the motive forces. The poor, the marginalized, those that, in fact, the description in terms of race, African, colored, and Indian, as well as gender outlook. So, and that is the nature of the poverty outlook in this country, and that is what it seeks actually to address. How the policy therefore gets implemented is a different debate. But the nature and the formation of the state, it is developmentalist nature, let alone that we spend over 62% of our budget, on social imperatives. We are actually moving away from being a developmental state now into a nanny state, where you would spend more money on consumption, which is your social imperatives, and less money on your productive imperatives, which is investment in your fixed capital formation and so on. So the point I'm making here is that we are a developmental state. How, therefore, the character of the leadership tends to present and project itself, it's a different debate than the policy crust. And I also tend to loathe the issue, Chair, of using the terminology of the ruling elite. Us, as a progressive movement, we don't talk about elite, because elite means that it's the leadership by the rich, which is a perpetuation of the feudal system, as well as a capitalist system that seeks to exploit the poor. We talk about the leadership, the orientation of the leadership. I'm not sure whether I would use the word elite, because it has got its own ideological foundation, which is based on feudalism as well as capitalism, which is anchor is exploiting, the poor. Then the other issue, Chair, here that I would like to address is the issue where we say, what then becomes the role of these developmental institutions in terms of their social mandates? It is quite clear, and I think it has been well articulated, that they need to take their line of march or cue from the government. And they need to be able to express the government's agenda, the government's policy or manifesto through their department's policy and their implementation. So what you are currently seeing, you are seeing that particular mismatch, which, because of that particular mismatch, any and everybody is doing whatever they like. There is no seamless policy coordination, and by extension, government then tends to underperform because there isn't any center. Hence, the proposition that says, if you do have a model framework that is overarching and puts everything together, you are able to have policy certainty, but you're able to make sure that there is in fact, optimal performance. My second last point, Chair, is that there is no doubt that privatization is not a solution to our problems and privatizing by our state-owned companies. The solution is to find partnerships with the private sector. The relationship between government and the private sector is gradually improving, and it must be improved. You will see that in many economies that in fact are successful, whether in Asia, whether in the Latin American countries or any other developing market, you have this common and a shared vision where there's a convergence of vision between government and the private sector. In our country, there is still that relationship of lack of trust because of the manifestation of race and apartheid, a legacy. But I'm saying, without belaboring the point, is that our key for our entities to be able to deliver is to be able that in their DNA as well, have easy ways to partner with the private sector. And what it means, therefore, is that we need to be able to fundamentally change certain aspects of the Public Finance Management Act, because Public Finance Management Act, to a greater extent, is a disenabler towards sustainable partnerships. In a sense that part of the work that I do project finance. It is so difficult to structure any deal with a government entity because of the rigidity in the financial architecture of a government in terms of ruling. So we need to be able to make sure that the financial legislation and governance enables government to easily partner with the private sector. It must not actually be difficult. I know my colleague, Comrade Gigaba, spoke about the triple Ps. The triple Ps, and he will know that very well. We had lots of discussions in various forums ourselves, and him is that they are so onerous that it will take 3-4 years before a deal is concluded. So it means they're inefficient. No investor would want a deal to be structured for more than 3-4 years. So we need to find means and ways in the Public Finance Management Act to enable these deals to be structured quite easy without actually compromising governance. And in conclusion, Comrade Chair, is that these entities, as I actually earlier indicated, they must assist government to be able to meet its mandate. I made a typical point about the DFIs earlier on, that these DFIs, they price themselves out of the market. They price themselves even more than what the private sector is pricing. If the role of government and the mandate of government is to ensure that we ameliorate poverty, we deal with issues of unemployment, we deal with issues of access to a capital, which entities are best placed to be able to assist in the access to capital, SMMEs, as well as access to productive opportunities, except the DFIs, but they don't play that role. So you do need as well that these DFIs must be radically changed in terms of their policy, their credit granting policies, because they're not responsive, to government imperatives. So I will stop here now, Chair, because I know that many other aspects were comments, and I do believe strongly that we do need to play a role as SOEs in creating jobs. Many a times the externalization of government to the private sector, where there's a lot of outsourcing of work, it's killing the government of the day. If there's anything that would have learned from the apartheid government, was a lot of work was insourced and people had guarantees of work. If you guarantee work, you guarantee a stable households, you guarantee stable society, you guarantee a productive consumption. Currently with high unemployment and the externalization of the state, we will continuously have a situation where it is not in the interest of the private sector to create jobs, and this issue of unemployment will be perpetual. So therefore, to deal with these issues, let's also have the SOEs at the center of employment creation or job creation by insourcing some of these services and creating capacity, within government. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, comrades. And like I had indicated, is that this is it is an exercise of thinking and sharpening each other's thoughts, meaning it is continuous exercise. And I like the way you phrased it, that it is to enrich our leaders to think critically about certain matters. So I don't, as we're about to close this session now, I don't want the closing of the session to be a closing of the engagement. And I say this because we shouldn't limit our thoughts and our inputs to such small sessions. This is a 2-hour session. There is no way we can exhaust some of these matters, which actually need to be ventilated properly. And as the school, we do have, you can write. So we do encourage writing. And towards the end of the year, we will be publishing. We will be publishing and coming out with a writing block, but that will be explained at a later stage. If you could just keep looking at our social media and staying in touch, you will see that. So we are accepting written inputs. We are accepting written inputs, and we also have podcasts and other platforms which we do engage. So we have our master classes, which was this. Then we also have our public dialogues and public debates, which we would encourage that people who are here today, and a lot of people wrote in the comment section, we would like to encourage you to participate in these things. Let us not limit our discussion here today. And with that being said, I would like to send a special thank you to Comrade Gigaba, Comrade Golding. We really do appreciate it. And it was a very fruitful and enriching engagement. I'm seeing even in the comment section that people who are saying this is a thought-provoking discussions. These are fruitful engagements. So I'm very happy that we are leaving. There are people who are leaving this session with thoughts that you didn't have before, and you are leaving this discussion with your thoughts having been challenged, your ideas having been challenged, and that will make you sharper in your views. So with that being said, I would like to wrap it up and thank you. And as the school, we'd like to thank you for being present throughout the whole month. We've had a lot of activities throughout the month, and in all of our engagement, there were no less than 100 people present, whether it was physical or online, and there's just the continuous engagement. We truly do appreciate it, because that is what makes these sessions worthwhile and fruitful. We would also like to thank you, Comrade Gigaba, Comrade Golding, for the preparation, because of course this was prepared. We'd like to congratulate you on the PhD, but also just thank you for the preparation for this particular session. We do not take it for granted. I am leaving here with notes, so I know I'm going to be reading after this. So I know I'm not the only one. So thank you very much for that preparation. I would also like to thank the team from the school that made this possible. Caesar, I'm seeing Caesar's here, Comrade Geffen. So we just thank you, comrades, for being part of putting this together. And Comrade Caesar also will put in the comment section our email. So this is where you can send your submissions. So this is where you can send your submissions, and we will be sending some of them to Comrade Gigaba and Comrade Golding. We'll be sending it to them. If there's room for a response, we will also now create and establish those relationships for you to interact and continue with some of these ideas. So this is not the end, comrades. Please look in the comment section. There's our email, support@orthamboschool.org.za, and we will continue our engagements there. Then some of the topics which I've noted from this particular discussion will inform our coming weeks public engagement, public debate and public lecture. So some of the ideas which have been put on the table here will be ventilated in our public dialogues and public debates. So please look out for that again on our social media. And lastly, which is just a brief announcement, is that we are this week, we are concluding OR Tambo month, and we have 2 more activities. I think it's 2 more activities. If you could please kindly just stay glued to our social media, and you will see the different activities which we have left for Artambo month. And also we have our book club, which will be releasing the latest book that we'll be reviewing. And that will also be communicated in time so that everybody can read. And the next time we meet, we'll be able to have a good book review session. Thank you very much, comrades. We have reached the end of our session this evening. Thank you for everyone who made time. And please, those who are traveling, travel safe, and those who are home, have a good evening.
Thank you
Great
very much.
chairperson.
Good evening, comrade. Thanks so much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, comrades. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night. Good night.
Congratulations to Gigaba.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Thank
Bye,
you.
comrades.